So, Paul, I'm going to ask you to respond, but also, if you conclude your answer, just because I know you wrote about it in your book, The Bottom Billion, why you think that the China-India model isn't necessarily open to a lot of African countries, because I think that's also a question on our audience members' minds.
Yeah, and China and India share two characteristics which the Bottom Billion don't have. One is they're both huge, and big societies tend to be better governed. We'd like to think small is cozy, but actually small is personalized power and a lot of corruption. So big India, big China, power has to be institutionalized, and that helps. The other thing is that neither China nor India are rich in natural resources, and natural resources tend to produce a lot of misgovernance. And these are the features that are at the heart of the problem of the Bottom Billion, rather than aid. There have been examples of aid cut-offs. Zimbabwe's not had a whole lot of aid in the last decade. It's not exactly a model of improving governance.
They had $300 million in 2006 from the UK and US government.
It's had
$300 million US dollars.
It's had very little aid in recent years. And similarly, Eritrea has sort of tried to cut itself off from aid, but Eritrea is a tragedy of abuse, of personalized abuse of power. Dambisa started to describe the process of sort of no representation without taxation, but actually the process which forged effective states, which is a process fundamentally in Europe, was a much more brutal process than just taxation. And let me just describe it to you, because the punchline of this is we don't want this process in Africa. The process that forged effective states in Europe was rivalry, military rivalry between political elites in different countries. In order to win the international military struggles, they had to build high taxation to pay for the militaries. And then there was a Darwinian process in which the countries that managed to build the most effective tax systems won the international struggle. Now, the price that Europe paid for that was horrendous, and we can't possibly wish that process of international struggle on Africa. In other words, we can understand why the West managed to build effective states and Africa hasn't, without saying, the solution is for Africa just to repeat that process. We have to find a different and a better way to effective states.
Can I butt in?
Sure. Well, you're going to. A brief interjection, and then I'm going to go to Stephen.
India, China, what about Singapore? What about Taiwan? How about South Korea? How about Hong Kong? Why do you have to be big? How about Switzerland? How about Liechtenstein? How about Benelux? Why do you have to be big? Why define something different when here in Canada you've got something that works? Why not imitate what works?
I think if you start small and poor and resource-rich, you've got really big challenges in producing an effective state. Some do it. Botswana's managed it. Right? That shows, to my mind, just how tremendously good the early leadership of Botswana was. Social science doesn't work by hard and fast laws. It works by tendencies. Mm-hmm. But the tendency is if you're small, you're poor, you're resource-rich, you're in a trap. You're in a cul-de-sac. And that's where Africa's got to. It's not because of aid. Aid is a weak instrument along with other instruments.
We're all for aid.
Trying to get you out of that cul-de-sac.
We're not against humanitarian aid, remember. We're against the negative externalities that someone brings with it. We already said it. Who could be against charity? We're against the negative externalities of aid. And we're trying to improve the system. We all agree.
Can I just ask a follow-up question? Dambisa, Paul Collier writes quite eloquently in his book, The Bottom Billion, about some of these large structural factors, including the size of the country, good or poor neighbors, the degree to which natural resources are prevalent or not, the degree to which they have sea access or not. You offer a kind of interesting rebuttal, I thought, in your book, so maybe you could just share that with the audience, too, why those structural factors won't necessarily overwhelm the types of reforms that you're proposing.
I'm not sure which specific rebuttal you mean. It was such an excellent book that there's so many amazing rebuttals. But I mean, the obvious thing is incentives. We live in a society, if you live in the West, in a society of incentives. The governments are incentivized to do the right thing. Your institutions are incentivized to do the right thing. You as individuals are incentivized to do certain things, and to the extent that those things fall out of a common good, the legal system steps in to manage your behavior. In Africa, and certainly the aid system, we have a situation where the donors are incentivized to give money, even though they know that the money is not going to the right places. And African governments are incentivized to take the money because it's easier to take the money. Who wants to be walking around and pitching bonds around the world to 1,000 pension funds when actually all they do is rip you apart and ask you what your agenda is? When you don't really need to have an agenda, you can pick up the phone and call the World Bank for the next check. So you're in this low equilibrium where the incentive structure does not work. The question is, how do we get African governments to be incentivized to do the right thing? Because as I said earlier, we need African governments to be on board. We need them to get involved in terms of regional integration. I come from a landlocked country, 10 million people. Who cares? But in the Southern African context, we're talking about 200 million people. How do I get my government incentivized to be part of the Southern African community in a credible and a meaningful way that would actually work to improve the livelihoods of our society? The fact of the matter is, as long as they have a credible system of aid coming through year in, year out, whether there's a credit crisis or not, the fact of the matter is African governments are never going to be fully incentivized to do the right thing. With respect to aid, we've tried many different interventions. In the 1960s, we had aid for infrastructure. 1970s, aid for poverty and growth. 1980s, structural adjustment and stabilization programs. 1990s, aid for democracy and governance. 2000, we now have glamour aid, where anybody who feels like it can go and adopt a child and start running around the continent with a new scheme. It's been tried, but we're not addressing the fundamental point where we will never, ever, ever, by giving money to anybody for free, without there being any credible attached incentives, we will never get a situation where we get the institutions and the growth and the reduction in poverty that we're seeking. We know this. We know what China has done. We know what India has done, Brazil, Russia, even on the African continent itself, South Africa and Botswana. These countries do not rely on aid to the extent that most African countries do. Let's not try and invent a wheel. We know what works. Just change your attitude with respect to Africa. I'm not letting you off the hook. I'm not saying go to your homes and not do anything with respect to Africa. I'm saying we know how to intervene. Provide capital in terms of microfinance to support entrepreneurs. Encourage your governments to open their markets to the extent that they won't, which they probably won't. Encourage them to treat African policymakers, hold them to account, and treat them as equals as opposed to as children. If we get past that, I'm telling you, my continent will rise and it will be an equal partner on the global stage.